The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly by the tall windows of their private quarters. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the official notification that had arrived just hours before. The words seemed to blur together on the cream-colored paper, but their meaning was crystal clear. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who had been the cornerstone of the British monarchy for over 70 years, had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. William found her there, still in her nightgown, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air between them. For a long moment, they simply stood together in silence, processing the enormity of what lay ahead. The woman who had welcomed Catherine into the royal family with such warmth and grace was gone. She was reading just yesterday, Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. The staff said she was still going through her red boxes, still working. William wrapped his arms around his wife, feeling the weight of duty and grief settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. In an instant, everything had changed. His father was now King Charles III, and William himself had become the heir apparent to the throne. The first phone call came within minutes. Then another, and another. The private world they had carefully built around their family was about to be torn open as the eyes of the entire world turned to them. Catherine stepped away from the window and began moving with purpose, the initial shock giving way to the sense of duty that had been carefully cultivated over her years as a working royal. Their children were still asleep in their rooms down the hall, blissfully unaware that their great-grandmother, the woman they called Gone, would never again greet them with her warm smile and twinkling eyes. Catherine and William exchanged a look that spoke volumes. How do you tell 3 young children that the Queen is gone? How do you prepare them for the intense scrutiny and ceremony that would follow? William's phone buzzed again. His father's private secretary was calling from Scotland, where Charles was now receiving the formal acknowledgement of his new role as king. The constitutional machinery was already in motion, but the human cost of this transition was just beginning to unfold. Catherine reached for William's hand as he answered the call, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that would become symbolic of their united front in the difficult days ahead. The news would break to the public within the hour, but for these precious few minutes, their grief remained private. Catherine thought of the last time she had seen the Queen, just weeks before at the traditional summer gathering at Balmoral. Her Majesty had been friendlier than usual, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She had pulled Catherine aside during tea and spoken quietly about the importance of family, of staying true to one's values even when the weight of public expectation felt overwhelming. "Promise me you'll take care of him," the Queen had said, her eyes twinkling with affection as she glanced toward William, who was engaged in an animated conversation with Prince George about football. "The crown can be lonely, but it doesn't have to be," Catherine had promised, never imagining that conversation would take on such profound meaning so soon. Now, as they prepared to step into their new roles, Catherine felt the full weight of that promise. William would need her strength more than ever as he navigated the complex transition from Duke of Cambridge to Prince of Wales, and eventually to King. But more than that, their children would need both of them to guide them through a world that had suddenly become much more complicated and public. The morning light grew stronger, and with it came the realization that their private moment of mourning was coming to an end. Soon, they would need to put on their public faces to comfort a nation that was about to lose the only monarch most of them had ever known. But, for now, in the quiet sanctuary of their home, Catherine and William held each other close and remembered the remarkable woman who had shaped their lives in ways both profound and deeply personal. The announcement came at exactly 6:30 p.m. Catherine watched from the drawing room as William's press secretary read the carefully crafted statement to the gathered media outside Buckingham Palace. "The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow." The words felt surreal, official, and somehow inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Within minutes, the floodgates opened. Television networks around the world interrupted their regular programming. Social media exploded with tributes, memories, and shock. The flags began to lower to half-mast across the Commonwealth. Catherine could hear the distant sound of church bells beginning to toll across London, their mournful rhythm echoing the collective heartbreak of a nation. Their children had taken the news better than expected. Prince George, now 9 years old, had asked thoughtful questions about what this meant for their family. Princess Charlotte, 7, had cried quietly when she realized there would be no more visits to Gongon's horses at Windsor. Little Prince Louis, only 4, didn't quite understand why everyone looked so sad, but he sensed the gravity of the situation and stayed close to his mother's side. "Will we still live here?" Charlotte had asked, curled up in Catherine's lap as they sat together on the sofa. It was a simple question that carried enormous implications. Their life at Kensington Palace, the careful balance they had struck between royal duties and family life, everything was about to change. William was now the Prince of Wales, and with that title came expectations, traditions, and responsibilities that would reshape their entire existence. Catherine had answered honestly, as she always did with their children. "We don't know yet, sweetheart. But wherever we live, we'll be together, and that's what matters most." It was a promise she intended to keep, even as she felt the weight of centuries of royal protocol pressing down upon them. The first test of their new reality came that very evening. Protocol demanded that William, as the new heir to the throne, make a statement on behalf of the family. Catherine sat beside him as he recorded a brief video message from their private study, her presence just off camera, but symbolically crucial. His words were carefully chosen, balancing personal grief with public duty, honoring his grandmother's memory while acknowledging the nation's loss. "My grandmother famously said that grief is the price we pay for love," William said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "All of the sadness we will feel in the coming weeks will be testament to the love we felt for our extraordinary queen. I will honor her memory by continuing the selfless service to others that defined her reign." Catherine knew how difficult those words were for him to say. William had always been fiercely protective of his family's privacy, traumatized by the intense media scrutiny that had surrounded his mother's death when he was just 15 years old. Now, at the moment of his deepest personal grief, he was required to share his emotions with the world, to be both son and prince, grandson and future king. After the recording was finished, they walked together through the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace. The building felt different somehow, charged with the weight of history and expectation. Catherine noticed how William carried himself differently now, his posture more formal, his expression more guarded. The transformation had been almost instantaneous, as if a switch had been flipped the moment the Queen drew her last breath. They paused outside the children's rooms, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing through the slightly open doors. Tomorrow, everything would change. There would be meetings with constitutional experts, discussions about new titles and residences, preparation for a funeral that would be watched by billions of people around the world. But tonight, they were still just parents, still just a husband and wife grieving the loss of someone they loved. Catherine took William's hand and led him to their private sitting room, where a fire crackled softly in the grate. She poured 2 glasses of wine, and they sat together in comfortable silence, processing the day's events. The weight of their new responsibilities felt enormous, but Catherine drew strength from the Queen's own example. Elizabeth had been just 25 years old when she became Queen, younger than Catherine was now, and she had navigated the challenges with grace, dignity, and an unwavering sense of duty. "She would want us to take care of each other," Catherine said quietly, echoing the Queen's words from their last private conversation. William nodded, pulling his wife closer. Tomorrow would bring challenges they could barely imagine, but they would face them together, drawing strength from their love for each other and their shared commitment to serving the country the Queen had loved so deeply. The morning after the Queen's death dawned gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood that had settled over the entire United Kingdom. Catherine woke early to find William already dressed, standing by their bedroom window and watching the crowds that had begun to gather outside the palace gates. Even at this early hour, people were arriving with flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs of the Queen, creating an impromptu shrine that would grow throughout the day. "They loved her so much," William said softly as Catherine joined him at the window. Below them, an elderly woman in a bright purple coat was carefully placing a bouquet of roses against the palace railings, tears streaming down her cheeks. A young father lifted his toddler to see over the growing pile of tributes, explaining in gentle tones that they were saying goodbye to the Queen. The scene was being repeated at royal residences across the country, as millions of people sought a way to express their grief and gratitude. Catherine wrapped her arms around her husband's waist, feeling the tension in his shoulders. Today would mark the beginning of what palace officials were calling the 10-day bridge between the Queen's death and her state funeral. It would be 10 days of carefully orchestrated ceremonies, public appearances, and constitutional processes that would test every member of the royal family to their limits. Their first official duty came at midday, when they would join King Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla at Buckingham Palace to receive the new king's proclamation. It was a ceremony steeped in centuries of tradition, but for Catherine and William, it represented something much more personal. The moment when their private grief would become public property, when they would be expected to comfort a nation while processing their own loss. Catherine chose her outfit carefully that morning, selecting a black dress that was both appropriately somber and respectful of royal protocol. As she pinned a small diamond brooch to her lapel, a gift from the Queen on her first wedding anniversary, she thought about the conversations they had shared over the years. The Queen had been a source of quiet wisdom and steady support, always available with gentle advice when Catherine felt overwhelmed by the expectations of royal life. The children were staying at school for now, protected from the immediate intensity of the media coverage by their security teams and the careful planning of their parents. Catherine had spoken to each of their teachers personally that morning, asking them to watch for any signs that the children might be struggling with the enormity of what was happening. Prince George, in particular, was old enough to understand that his future had just become much more complicated and public. As they prepared to leave for Buckingham Palace, Catherine and William took a moment to review the schedule that had been hastily arranged by their private secretaries. There would be the proclamation ceremony, followed by meetings with Commonwealth representatives, then a private audience with the Archbishop of Canterbury. In the evening, they would attend a reception for visiting dignitaries who had begun arriving in London for the funeral. The drive to Buckingham Palace was unlike anything Catherine had experienced before. The streets were lined with people, many of them holding flags or photographs of the Queen. The atmosphere was respectful but electric, charged with the kind of historic significance that occurs perhaps once in a lifetime. As their car approached the palace gates, Catherine could see the massive floral tributes that had already accumulated, creating a colorful carpet of remembrance that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was formal and subdued. Palace staff, many of whom had worked for the Queen for decades, moved through their duties with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands. Catherine made a point of speaking to several of them, offering quiet words of comfort and acknowledging their personal loss. These were people who had seen the Queen every day, who had known her not just as a monarch but as an employer, a friend, and, in some cases, a maternal figure. The proclamation ceremony itself was a masterpiece of constitutional precision. King Charles III stood solemnly as the formal declaration of his accession was read aloud, his voice steady as he swore to uphold the values and traditions that had defined his mother's reign. Catherine watched from nearby, acutely aware that she was witnessing a moment that would be recorded in history books for centuries to come. But it was the smaller moments that touched her heart. The way William's hand briefly squeezed his father's shoulder as they prepared to face the gathered dignitaries. The sight of Queen Consort Camilla dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief during a particularly moving tribute. The gentle way King Charles spoke to his grandchildren when they joined them briefly for a private family dinner that evening. As the day drew to a close, Catherine and William found themselves back at Kensington Palace, emotionally drained but somehow strengthened by the shared experience of public service. They had begun to understand what the Queen had meant when she spoke about the solace that could be found in duty, the way that serving others could provide comfort during the darkest moments of personal grief. She would be proud of how we handled today, Catherine said as they prepared for bed, thinking of the Queen's own grace under pressure during countless state occasions and national crises. William nodded, already thinking ahead to the challenges that tomorrow would bring. There would be more ceremonies, more public appearances, more opportunities to honor his grandmother's memory while supporting a grieving nation. But, tonight, they were simply a couple who had lost someone they loved, finding strength in each other and in the knowledge that they were not facing this journey alone. The Westminster Hall lying-in state ceremony marked a turning point in the national mourning period. Catherine stood beside William as they watched the Queen's coffin being carried into the ancient hall where it would rest for 4 days, allowing the public to pay their final respects. The queue of people waiting to see the Queen stretched for miles along the Thames, a river of humanity that grew longer with each passing hour. Catherine had never seen anything quite like it. People of all ages, backgrounds, and nationalities waited patiently for up to 24 hours, sharing stories about how the Queen had touched their lives. Elderly veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with young families, Immigrants who had found new lives in Britain walked alongside those whose families had lived in the same villages for generations. The diversity of the crowd reflected the Queen's own ability to unite people across every possible division. She would be amazed by this, William said quietly as they watched the endless stream of people filing past the coffin. Each person paused for just a moment, some bowing their heads, others offering silent prayers, many wiping away tears. The hall was filled with a profound sense of reverence that transcended religious or cultural differences. Catherine had insisted on spending time among the crowds herself, walking along the queue with William to thank people for coming and to share in their memories of the Queen. It was an unprecedented decision that broke with royal protocol, but Catherine felt strongly that this moment called for connection rather than distance. The Queen herself had always believed in the importance of being seen and accessible to her people. The conversations they had during those walkabouts would stay with Catherine forever. An elderly woman from Scotland spoke through tears about how the Queen had visited her village after a devastating flood, spending hours talking with residents and bringing comfort during their darkest hour. A young man from Jamaica described how seeing the Queen's portrait in his grandmother's house had been his first connection to British history when his family emigrated. A middle-aged teacher from Wales explained how she had used the Queen's example of dignity and service to inspire her students to become engaged citizens. Each story added another layer to Catherine's understanding of the Queen's remarkable legacy. This was more than just the passing of a monarch. It was the end of an era that had shaped the lives of billions of people around the world. The Queen had been a constant presence through 7 decades of dramatic change, a symbol of stability and continuity in an increasingly uncertain world. The most challenging moment came when they encountered a group of military veterans, some in wheelchairs, who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. Many of them had met the Queen during her visits to military hospitals or during medal ceremonies. Their stories of her warmth, humor, and genuine interest in their experiences brought tears to Catherine's eyes. One elderly man, who had served in the Falklands War, pressed a small photograph into William's hand. "She saved my life," he said simply. "Not physically, but mentally. After I came back from the war, I was lost. But when she pinned my medal on my chest and looked me in the eye, she said, 'Thank you for your courage.' It gave me the strength to keep going." William studied the photograph, which showed a much younger version of the man standing proudly beside the Queen after receiving his honor. Catherine watched her husband's face as he listened to these stories, seeing how each one affected him deeply. She knew that William was struggling with the balance between his private grief and his public role, between honoring his grandmother's memory and managing his own emotions. The weight of expectation from the public was enormous, and Catherine could see how it was taking a toll on him. That evening, after another long day of official duties, Catherine found William sitting alone in their private study, staring at a photograph of the Queen with their children from the previous Christmas. The image captured a perfect moment of family happiness. The Queen laughing as Prince Louis showed her a drawing he had made, Princess Charlotte leaning against her great-grandmother's arm, Prince George standing proudly beside his father. "They'll never have new memories of her," William said quietly. It was the first time Catherine had seen him truly break down since the Queen's death. She sat beside him, not offering empty platitudes, but simply being present as he processed the magnitude of their loss. "But they have these beautiful memories," Catherine replied, touching the photograph gently. "And they have her example. They have the stories we'll tell them about her kindness, her strength, her dedication to service. They have the love she showed them every time they were together." William nodded, wiping his eyes. Catherine knew that this moment of vulnerability was exactly what he needed. For days, he had been the perfect prince, the dutiful son, the composed public figure. But here, in the privacy of their home, he could simply be a grandson who missed his grandmother terribly. As they sat together in the quiet room, Catherine felt the full weight of the promise she had made to the Queen. Taking care of William meant being his anchor during moments like this, when the demands of duty threatened to overwhelm his human capacity for grief. It meant protecting their children's memories of their great-grandmother while preparing them for the increased scrutiny that would come with their father's new role as Prince of Wales. The next morning would bring new challenges, more ceremonies, more public appearances. But tonight, Catherine held her husband close and grieved not just for a queen, but for a woman who had loved their family with the fierce protectiveness of any grandmother, and who had shaped their lives in ways both profound and deeply personal. The morning of the state funeral dawned crisp and clear as if the weather itself was paying tribute to Queen Elizabeth II. Catherine woke before dawn, her mind already focused on the historic day ahead. This would be the largest gathering of world leaders in decades, with over 2,000 guests expected to attend Westminster Abbey for a ceremony that would be watched by an estimated 4 billion people around the globe. As she dressed in her formal black coat dress, carefully selecting the same pearl necklace and diamond earrings that the Queen had worn to Prince Philip's funeral, Catherine thought about the significance of this moment. This wasn't just a goodbye to a beloved grandmother. It was the final chapter of a reign that had defined modern Britain and shaped the Commonwealth for over 70 years. William appeared at their bedroom door, already dressed in his military ceremonial uniform, his face set with the kind of determined composure that Catherine had come to recognize during their most challenging public moments. Their children were dressed and waiting downstairs, Prince George and Princess Charlotte old enough to understand the solemnity of the occasion, little Prince Louis staying home as the ceremony would be too long and intense for a 4-year-old. The drive to Westminster Abbey was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. The streets of London were lined with hundreds of thousands of people, all standing in respectful silence as the funeral procession made its way through the capital. The only sounds were the clip-clop of horses' hooves, the rumble of the gun carriage wheels, and the distant tolling of church bells across the city. Catherine watched from the car as they passed faces etched with genuine grief and gratitude. Many people held photographs of the Queen from different eras of her reign, creating a visual timeline of a life dedicated to service. Some had traveled from across the Commonwealth, wearing traditional dress from their home countries as a tribute to the monarch who had visited them and celebrated their cultures. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was electric with historical significance. Catherine took her place in the front row beside William and their children, acutely aware that she was part of a moment that would be remembered for centuries. World leaders filled the ancient church, but the focus remained firmly on the family who had lost not just a queen, but a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. The service itself was a masterpiece of dignity and emotion. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke eloquently about the Queen's faith and dedication, while the hymns chosen reflected both her personal preferences and the nation's affection. Catherine felt William's hand tighten around hers during the final hymn, "The Lord is my shepherd," which had been played at their wedding 11 years earlier. But it was the smaller, more personal moments that would stay with Catherine forever. The way King Charles III's voice trembled slightly as he read one of the lessons. The sight of the Queen's corgis waiting outside the chapel, adding a touch of warmth to the formal proceedings. The moment when Princess Charlotte reached for Catherine's hand during a particularly moving prayer, seeking comfort in the overwhelming environment. As the service concluded and the coffin was carried out of the abbey, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. They had honored the Queen's memory with dignity and grace, bringing together a grieving nation in a ceremony that celebrated not just her life, but the values she had embodied throughout her reign. The procession to Windsor Castle for the private burial was smaller and more intimate, allowing the family to begin their personal goodbye to the woman they had known away from the cameras and crowds. Catherine watched as William walked behind his grandmother's coffin one final time, his shoulders straight despite the weight of emotion and expectation he was carrying. At St. George's Chapel, surrounded only by close family and friends, the Queen was laid to rest beside Prince Philip in a ceremony that was heartbreakingly simple. Catherine stood with her arms around Prince George and Princess Charlotte, helping them understand this final moment while processing her own grief for the woman who had welcomed her into the royal family with such warmth and wisdom. After the burial, as the family gathered at Windsor Castle for a private reception, Catherine found herself thinking about the Queen's legacy and what it meant for her own future. The woman who had guided the monarchy through decades of change had passed the torch to a new generation, and Catherine knew that she and William would be expected to carry forward that tradition of service and dedication. Later that evening, when they were finally alone at Kensington Palace, Catherine and William sat together in their garden, sharing a quiet moment after the most emotionally challenging day of their lives. The children were asleep, exhausted by the long day and the weight of saying goodbye to their great-grandmother. She would have loved seeing all those people today, William said, thinking of the crowds who had lined the streets and the millions more who had watched around the world. She always said that the monarchy belonged to the people, not to us. Catherine nodded, remembering the Queen's words about service being a privilege rather than a burden. As they sat under the stars, she felt the presence of the woman who had shaped their lives so profoundly, and she knew that the Queen's example would guide them through the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The funeral had marked the end of an era, but it had also been the beginning of something new. William was now the Prince of Wales, heir to a throne that carried enormous responsibility and opportunity. Catherine was the Princess of Wales, a title that came with its own history and expectations. Together, they would work to honor the Queen's memory while building a monarchy that reflected their own values and the needs of a changing world. As they prepared for bed, Catherine took one last look at the photograph of the Queen that sat on their bedside table. In it, Elizabeth was smiling broadly, surrounded by her great-grandchildren during a summer afternoon at Balmoral. It was a reminder that behind all the ceremony and protocol was simply a woman who had loved her family deeply and served her people with unwavering dedication. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve. But tonight, Catherine felt grateful for the example the Queen had set, the love she had shown, and the legacy she had left for future generations to follow. The farewell had touched an entire nation, but for Catherine and William, it had been something even more precious, a final lesson in grace, dignity, and the power of love to sustain us through even our darkest moments.